right, thank you so much. So I'm Tracie Prater. I'm from NASA Marshall Spaceflight Center, 2 hours south of here in Huntsville, Alabama. So Marshall was actually the lead center for the development of the Saturn V rocket, which played a pretty pivotal role in the story you just saw. So I love space, I love movies. I'm always grateful to Belcourt for letting me participate in Science on Screen. So I'm going to help lead a post-film discussion of First Man with Drew Garrett. So he was a NASA payload specialist and astronaut from 1984 to 1991. He flew aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia in 1991 and performed experiments related to the effects of microgravity on human physiology, which we'll talk about more. He was a professor of medicine at Vanderbilt from 1992 to 2017, and has done a great deal of research on patient safety. He's also a sailor and has sailed 30,000 miles on a sailboat. So, explorer of space and sea, Dr. Drew Garrett. Oh, I'm so sorry, Gaffney. I'm very nervous.
That's right, it's Gaffney.
It's Gaffney. Wow. Okay.
What are the G's? It's okay.
We'll fix that. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to start the conversation. I'm an engineer, and I think when engineers think about spaceflight, we think that if we can, develop a more efficient engine or find a more thermally resistant material or make more reliable software, that all of this will be easy. But really, one of the hardest parts of a spaceflight is the human aspect. And so Drew has done a lot of research on the effects of microgravity on human physiology. So I wanted to kind of start this conversation with helping us to understand, kind of at the frontiers and the dawn of the space era, what was known about the effects of microgravity on human physiology. We have a body of research from the Space Shuttle program, which you were part of in the International Space Station, which tell us about bone loss and muscle atrophy and vision changes. But what did we know in the 60s? And then if you could also reflect a little bit on how the training that we see Armstrong and his colleagues go through in the movie was different than the training you went through as a shuttle astronaut based on lessons learned from Apollo and then from Skylab as well.
Yeah, I guess the first thing is I've never seen anything that captured all of the emotion and the family and sort of the backstory that being an astronaut, and you saw the personality, and it was absolutely typical. You're sort of, if you didn't know it before you got there, you learned it, because that's how everybody was. And but at the same time, I got there, and I had two children. One was, I guess, 3 years old when I went there, and the other was at elementary school. And they went to Ed White Elementary School. And they didn't make the connection until after the Challenger, which was before our flight. So interestingly, the NASA does all this stuff to prepare you, and they actually even have hired some network gurus, and you get to go to this 3-day course on how to deal with the press. But I don't think anybody ever said a word about how you handle your family. And when I was thinking about this in the shuttle flights, you did exactly what everybody did in any space flight in the U.S. You stayed in the same crew quarters, you ate at the same table, you went down to the suit room in those lounger chairs and put on whichever suit your mission had. You walked out, you got in the same aluminum bus, and you went up to the pad. one thing that they didn't show, and I think it may be new, is in the shuttle program, they took the families out to see the shuttle. It's at the tower. They've moved away the service structure, so you really see the orbiter and the solid rocket boosters. It's really impressive. And they videotape a message from the families. And so my kids were there, and one of the other astronauts is taking the picture, and he's trying to get them to say something. And my then 10-year-old, her arms were folded, she was not happy, and he kept saying, "Tell your dad something, tell him, this is where to show him." She said, "Don't go." And she'd already had that conversation a couple times with me before, but right up to the end. Because if you think about it, the families don't get anything out of this. They risk their parent, but they don't get to go. So this movie has been really powerful and brings back obviously a lot of memories. The first astronauts had the misfortune of a lot of postulates and hypotheses about what would happen when somebody went into space. And so they didn't want anything happening, so they did all sorts of testing, and you saw the allusion to it with the ice water bath. You know, if you can come down, water is 6/7 of the Earth, so you could come down in ice water. And so they wanted to make sure that people knew how to survive in ice water. They also did tricks, like they screened for motion sickness, and they screened for claustrophobia. But they didn't tell you that's what they were doing, and they asked you if you'd mind helping them with, it was called a personal rescue sphere. And it's basically a big Nomex pressurized beach ball. It's about this big, and you crawl into it in a ball. You've got a cap with a headset on it and a mic, and it's just roaring because they're pressurizing it. And, you know, and by the time, it was the end of the day, and I set my watch and went to sleep. And it was about 5 minutes, and I could hear them. They sort of moved the ball, and they said, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yeah, I was sleeping." And then I found out later that was the claustrophobia test, and so I passed. Vestibular stuff is a big problem in that virtually all people who fly in space get sick. And some of them get really sick. And so they've worked very hard. They can't prevent it, and it's whether you're a fighter pilot or a university professor. And so they've gotten good with the medicines, and we use the same stuff you would get if you had a migraine and went to the emergency room. And it works. And you spend the first day, I had a whole pocket full of syringes, as did one of the other docs, and we gave them out during the first day of the mission. The long-term effect that we didn't really know about has to do with the eyes. And there's a phenomena where there are times when you're not in the full sort of covering of the Earth in the sense of reducing radiation. And so something called solar particles, these are heavy relative to atoms. It's the nucleus, and when it hits the retina, it causes the 4th of July. And so that was something that fortunately doesn't do any harm, but it's quite a surprise. The other part of it, though, that's become obvious on the space station and would be relative going to Mars, is you're if you've seen people in space, their face is sort of fat, their neck veins are swollen, their legs get really skinny. And that's because the fluid that, in my case, is 70% of my blood is below my heart as I stand here. In space, it's up here because there's no gravity. And so you get swelling, and over time, the retina in the eye actually will develop folds or wrinkles. So they're working on that now. But I think, and this is just my opinion, not NASA's official position, is that we could go to Mars. You could either go in 2 years plus, or you could do a sprint mission in about 13 months. That gives you a month on the surface of Mars. And so the problems are you're going to have an international male and female crew in a very small space, like a school bus or a camper trailer, for 13 months or 2 years. So the psychological aspects are big. The same radiation that makes fireworks in the eye can be fatal if you happen to have the right solar activity or the wrong solar activity. And to my knowledge, there's no solution for that yet. Lead makes it worse because this stuff goes right through the lead and it picks up particles with it, and you get a bigger hit on the backside of the lead than you would have if you'd just been in front. So radiation's a big problem. The psychology is a big problem. And then the bone is pretty much worked out. So, I mean, starting with a super long list and all these terrible things we did to astronauts to test them in the beginning, we're now down to very few things, which is from the research.
Mm-hmm. Space station primarily.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you mentioned kind of in your opening remarks that I want to come back to, you talked about your time in the astronaut corps and Challenger. And so risk is something that's really at the forefront of this film. We see Neil Armstrong have this incident where the X-15 balloons up to open the movie. We see the Agena incident on Gemini, which is one of the most harrowing incidents in the history of human spaceflight. We see the accident with the lunar lander prototype as well. We see him lose friends in a training aircraft accident, and then the Apollo 1 fire. But that doesn't change, his desire to be an explorer and to be part of the Apollo 11 crew. So I was wondering if you could reflect on how you, as an astronaut, assess risk and how the Challenger tragedy, which happened during your time in the astronaut corps, perhaps altered that perspective a little.
Yeah, I was a professor at the University of Texas and was just loaned to NASA for what turned out to be 8 years, or almost 9. And I think in some ways I was naive. I had tremendous respect for the kind of can-do and the precision and the care and the systems that we all know NASA has contributed so much to society. But the Challenger was a screw-up. It was an organizational screw-up. They knew they had a technical problem, but they didn't solve it, and that was an organizational problem. The same thing with the vehicle I flew on was just Columbia. And it's the one that blew up, about 17 years later.
2003.
And both of those were organizational. So after the Challenger, you sort of lost some of your naivete. And at the time, I was also a flight surgeon in the Air Force, and I was at the Air National Guard. So I had a lot of NASA pilots and engineers who were in the Air National Guard. And I realized that nobody was talking about any of this. So I started talking to the pilots when they come in for their physical, the NASA ones. And I said, how you doing? And how are you can always ask how your colleagues are doing, how the other pilots are doing. They won't tell you they have a problem, but they'll tell you other people's. And I had one pilot, he says, no, we're pilots. We're used to people, auguring in and whatever phrase. We have a lot of phrases for pilots and crashing, which is part of the denial. And I said, yeah, but this is different. Every night you go home and it's on TV. And he said, oh, I don't watch TV anymore. So he's telling me it didn't bother him, but he hadn't watched television since the day the Challenger blew up. And it was like 4 or 5 months later. So when the Columbia exploded, it was a totally different scenario, and people really helped. And they had help for the not only the pilots, but everybody who worked at NASA, because it's a big family. And everybody's invested in the success of those flights. So I think it's ever present. And I mean, my personal approach was to have a bucket list, and this was before they had bucket lists. They didn't call them that. And I just thought, what did I want to do before I died? And I did almost all of it. And then we did the flight, and you sort of make peace with it. You just say, okay, I'm going to do this, and this is the only way to get up there. And I, my pulse was in the 70s when we lifted off. I was pretty psyched to just do it. One point, coming back, you're basically on fire. Because you're coming back in and you hit the atmosphere at about 15,000 miles an hour. And it's like a plasma TV. Well, the shuttle is a plasma screen, and you're just seeing all this flame and glow. And my blood pressure was about 70/40 because I had a pressure line that wasn't working for my G-suit, my fault. And I really thought it would be a shame to lose it at this point, because it's only another 15 minutes. And I talked to friends who, flew combat, and they have it's the last mission. And, I got off the shuttle, and my kids were there, and I cried. Just hugged them. So there's a lot of emotion attached to this.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if any of you have seen the Apollo 11 documentary, but during it's excellent. Yeah. But during the lunar landing, Armstrong's heart rate was around 160 resting. So.
Yeah, coming back was different. You're short in blood. You've lost about more than a unit of blood, and your blood pressure control mechanisms are not working. And the G-suit only gives you about 1 G of support. And so everybody is we say tachycardia, just tacking along, coming back. And I was 160. Yeah, pretty normal.
So at the end of the film, we end with kind of the shot of Ryan Gosling staring stoically into the camera. There's a lot of stoic Gosling staring in First Man. And so I like to think that he's kind of reflecting upon this experience. And so a book that I just finished is called Moondust, and it's by Andrew Smith, and it's reflections of most of the Apollo astronauts on how the experience of spaceflight changed them. And so I was wondering if you could offer some thoughts on that. Neil Armstrong said that, looking back at the Earth from space made him feel very, very small. Other astronauts have said that it kind of gave them more of a global perspective about our problems here on Earth.
Yeah, I think it's actually twofold. The being in space really is incredible, and when you're on on the shuttle missions, it's the same with space station. You are really busy. Your schedule is 5-minute blocks for every day of the mission, and so you don't have a lot of time. But any time you can get, you're looking out at the Earth, And on the shuttle, you flew upside down because that's where the windows were, and you could see the Earth. And I could see where I grew up in New Mexico and where my grandfather would drive me from Carlsbad over the Guadalupe Mountains and over to Alamogordo, and it would take all day, and it took a few seconds. But you could see, I could see the Krogers in Clear Lake with the binocs. People say you can't. Well, you can. If it's a clear down there, you could see it. So it really is one Earth. But the other part, which I know lots of us have done, I would go back from NASA, where I was an astronaut, and I'd go back and be a cardiologist in the CCU at Parkland Hospital. And I was very aware that I hadn't changed. At least I was the same person. And it really struck me that you have so much more power to do things than you ever realize. And that it's okay to dream, and it's okay to sort of aim high, because the people who do that, to some extent, are just like you. And I knew that. I knew who I was, and I still was. And so one minute I'm wearing a blue suit, and then the other minute I'm wearing a white coat. It's the same person. And I think that's a very valuable lesson.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up. You're welcome to stick around. I'm sorry I said your name wrong in the intro. Again, it's really embarrassing. But please take some NASA swag out on the table from our public affairs office. And thank you again for coming to Science on Screen.